In this programme, we take a look at 9 narrow-gauge lines during the 50s and 60s and also feature the Swansea and Mumbles Railway during its final months of operation. We start in Ireland with the Cavan and Leitrim Railway. This 3-foot gauge line is single-track throughout and passes through some of the most thinly populated parts of the country. The practice of building narrow-gauge lines alongside the road was fairly common in Ireland. The tramway, as it was always known, links the mining area of Arigna to the railway's headquarters at Ballinamore. The main line from Dromod to Belturbet was built in a more conventional style. Starting at the railway's southern terminus, the first station of any significance is at Mohill, a journey of some 5 miles. Most trains are mixed, and time is allowed in the schedule for the locomotive to shunt en route. Number 6T is one of 4 former Tralee and Dingle railway locomotives to see service on the Cavan and Leitrim. This 260 tank arrived in 1957. When the line opened in the summer of 1887, traffic did not come up to expectations, and it was only after 6 years that the railway began to show a profit. In those early days, there were 3 return trains running between Dromod and Belturbet, with the same number of connecting trains on the branch. There are 6 intermediate stations between Dromod and Ballinamore. With the exception of Mohill, the stations comprise just a single platform. There's no provision for trains to pass each other. By the 1950s, traffic had declined. Although the 3 departures from Dromod survive, 2 of these trains operate only as far as Ballinamore, leaving just 1 service to Belturbet. This service from Dromod is seen on the outskirts of Ballinamore, where it meets the line from Arigna. The 2 tracks run parallel for a few hundred yards to the station. Number 3T, a former Tralee and Dingle locomotive, awaits our arrival. This 260 tank was built by Hunslet in 1889 and was transferred to the Cavan and Leitrim in 1941. Ballinamore is the railway's main focal point. Here, trains on the main line connect with those on the branch to Drumshambo and Arigna. Shunting is needed to transfer wagons between the mainline trains and those serving the branch. We leave the main line for a while and take a look at number 3T as it makes a return journey on the branch. Construction began in 1886 in order to transport coal and iron ore, which was found at Arigna. Incidentally, it was this movement of coal which enabled the Cavan and Leitrim to survive for so long. Much of the route runs along the side of the road. This part of the C&L has always been known as the tramway. The railway's initial batch of 8 locomotives were 440 tanks built by Robert Stevenson of Newcastle. 4 of these were fitted with skirts and condensing gear for working on the tramway. In the early days, the C&L encountered considerable difficulty in complying with the Board of Trade regulations for tramways. Eventually, 2 locomotives were fitted with controls in front of the smoke box. This enabled the driver to have a clear view of the line ahead, but for reasons which never became known at the time, this practice turned out to be very short-lived. The only place of any significant size is Drumshambo. The station has a passing loop and sidings. It's situated on the outskirts of the village. Almost a mile further on, the railway crosses the Shannon, which is, incidentally, Ireland's longest river. The train travels a little over a mile to the terminus at Arigna. In 1918, the tramway was extended by a little over 4 miles to serve the pits at Orkabay and Derinavogi. Passenger trains never ran on the extension. The 260 tank is turned and sets off at 3:45 for Ballinamore. Demand for coal at the pits near Arignac varied considerably. During the Second World War, it was at a premium. Anything up to 6 trains ran each day in addition to the passenger workings. In the mid-50s, it was also particularly buoyant. By this time, there were just 2 passenger trains each day. This gave the operators plenty of opportunity to satisfy the demands of the cement works at Limerick and Drogheda in the east. There are numerous ungated level crossings on the tramway. Despite the very low volume of traffic, accidents were not unheard of. By the mid-50s, this became the only steam tramway in Ireland in regular use. Enthusiasts visited the line in some numbers during the final months of service. The train approaches Ballinamore. Note the line from Drummond in the foreground. Once the branch train has arrived, the connecting service to Drummond departs. Several sidings are located on the Belturbet side of the station, whilst the main shed stands adjacent to the station. The leading locomotive is one of the original 440s. 2 of these have survived the cutter's torch. There was also a locomotive works here, but this closed in 1930. Heavy overhauls were then carried out at Inchicore. It's now time to travel the remaining 17 miles of the Cavan and Leitrim Railway to Belturbet. At the third station, some 6 miles from Ballinamore, progress is halted while shunting takes place. Incidentally, this station was originally called Bourne-Boy Road and Templeport. Five miles further on is Ballyconnell. In the early days, there were 3 passenger trains in each direction, but by the time these pictures were taken, the service amounted to just 1 return train to Belturbet. Before continuing its journey, the Hunslet-built 260 tank has to add some cattle wagons to the formation. These 4-wheel wagons were built by Pickerings in 1904. After calling at Tompkin Road Station, the train approaches Journey's End at Belturbet. There's a cross-platform connection with the former Great Northern's broad gauge system. Goods traffic is transferred at a separate transshipment shed and platform. Remarkably, the coal from Arignac had to be shoveled by hand into the broad gauge wagons. By 1958, the Cavan and Leitrim was part of CIE and was losing some £40,000 a year. That year, the Irish government announced plans to build a new coal-fired power station near Arignac, which would absorb all the output from the mines in the area. It came as no surprise that the Cavan and Leitrim closed completely on the 31st of March 1959. It had been worked by steam traction throughout its lifetime. The County Donegal Railway. The County Donegal Railway is the largest of Ireland's 3-foot gauge lines with a massive 124.5 route miles. From the early 1930s, the CDR became a pioneer in the use of diesel rail cars for its passenger services. The map shows the full extent of the County Donegal system. When these pictures were taken in the late 50s, the lines to Londonderry and Glenties had been closed. Convoy is one of the 7 stations or halts between Letterkenny and Strabane. Railcar number 12 is one of 9 built by Walkers of Wigan. This example dates back to 1934. Its destination is Strabane. One of the later rail cars approaches Strabane with a surface from Letterkenny. Trains to and from Donegal use the other side of the island platform. The footbridge takes passengers to the broad gauge station, which is on the line from Londonderry to Omagh. A total of 23 steam locomotives were built for use on the railway. The first 3 entered traffic in 1882. In all, 5 different classes were built, each with a different wheel arrangement. The last of these were delivered from Naismith Wilson in 1912. By the late 30s, the fleet had been reduced to single figures as rail cars began to take over the passenger services. Mearn Glass was the first of the 264 tanks to enter traffic in 1907 as number 16 Donegal. In 1937, she became number 4 and is one of 3 members of this class to survive into preservation. When these pictures were taken in the late 50s, steam traction was used only occasionally on passenger trains, and only then on day excursions and enthusiast specials. In the main, it was the goods trains and associated shunting at Strabane which kept the steam fleet active. The shunting complete, the train leaves Strabane and takes the line to Stranola and Donegal. Shortly after, a goods train from Letterkenny arrives, whilst the passenger train waits in platform 3. The brake coach at the rear. Services on the narrow gauge line to Derry ceased in December 1954. Incidentally, steam traction was still fairly common motive power for the passenger trains on this section. A visit to Strabane would not be complete without a look at the railway's only diesel locomotive, number 11, Phoenix. It spent most of its time shunting here and is now in the care of the Belfast Transport Museum. The first part of the CDR to be built was the 14-mile section from Strabane to Stranola in 1863. The branch to Glenties opened somewhat later in 1895 and was the first part of the system to close to regular traffic in 1947. Incidentally, the original line from Strabane to Stranola was built to 5-foot 3-inch gauge. However, in 1893 it was converted to 3-foot gauge, resulting in the construction of this bridge over the River Morne just south of Strabane station. Stranola was once the junction for Glenties, but when these sequences were filmed in the late 50s, all traffic ran in a southwesterly direction to Donegal. Within a few miles of Stranola, we come to what is probably the most desolate part of the railway network. The first station is at Mearnglas, which is also the name of one of the line's locomotives. From here, the railway takes a course between the mountains, paralleling the course taken by the river Lowery Moor before reaching the station at Barnesmore. Here at Loch Esk, the builders of the line ran out of money. Almost 10 years elapsed before this section to Donegal opened, and even then funds did not run to building a station. This was eventually constructed by a different company which leased it to the railway. As we approach Donegal, the track on the left serves the branch to Ballyshannon, which was opened in 1905. At certain times each day, Donegal station is busy as rail cars to Ballyshannon and Killybegs connect into the train which arrives from Strabane. With losses on the increase and traffic on the decline, it was inevitable that this large 3-foot gauge system would close. The end came on December the 31st, 1959. However, quite a lot of the railway's locomotives, rail cars and coaches have survived. Our photographer took these sequences at Strabane in 1964. Nowadays, the stock has been dispersed, and a bypass occupies the site of the 2 stations at Strabane. Our coverage of the Isle of Man focuses on the Douglas to Peel section in the mid-60s. Who could have foreseen that within 2 years of these reopening celebrations in June 1967, a significant part of the railway network was to close? Nowadays, only the line from Douglas to Port Erin is steam-hauled, and the electric railway along the east coast to Ramsey is still in existence. The railway at St John's, once the junction for the lines to Peel and Ramsey, is no more. On the 3rd of June 1967, the locals are in a celebratory mood as they await the reopening special from Douglas. During the 60s, traffic had continued to decline, and in 1966, no services ran. However, the following year it was decided that the steam railway was an important tourist attraction, and services between Douglas and Peel would recommence. Five locomotives are in steam for this auspicious event. Number 15, Caledonia, is engaged in stock shunting duties at Douglas. Maitland, which hauled the reopening special, also has the honour of working the first service train. The location is Crosby, conveniently situated for Greeba Castle, the home of the famous Manx novelist Sir Hall Caine. To the west of Crosby, we see locomotive number 8, Fenella, which has charge of a service for Peel. This locomotive, which was built in 1894 by Bayer Peacock, was named after Fenella Tower at Peel. This engine carries its number, made from brass, on the chimney. Here's another view of Maitland on the reopening special as it sets off from St John's to Peel. The line on the left is used by trains to Ramsey. These services made a brief return in 1968, running on Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays only. As at Douglas, several locomotives are present to entertain the visitors at Peel. By using a fleet of tank locomotives, there's never been a requirement for a turntable on the island. Maitland is the motive power for this service from Peel to Douglas, which slows for the station at St John's. Trains started running here in 1873, and 6 years later St John's station area was modified to accommodate the line which had been built from Ramsey. 4 years later, work started on a railway to serve the mining area at Foxdale. Number 10, which is named G.H. Wood, heads for Douglas. At the opposite end of the station, number 5, Mona, leaves for Peel. We pay a brief visit to Union Mills, and then move to Douglas to sample the busy atmosphere of the largest station on the island. A few years later, the services to Peel and Ramsey ceased. Operations focused on the line to Port Erin, and the station was rationalised. The southern half, where our cameraman stood in June 1967, is presently occupied by a bus depot. This 2-mile-long system, which links the town of Llandudno to the top of the Great Orme, has changed little since these pictures were taken in 1959. But the fashions of the time, together with an almost total absence of cars, takes us back to the days when steam locomotives brought many of the visitors to this popular holiday resort. The railway is in 2 sections, each with 2 trams connected to the winding house in the middle at halfway station. The track gauge is 3 foot 6 inches. Here there's a short walk to another tram which runs to the summit, which is 672 feet above sea level. The two Bayer Peacock 060 tanks steal the limelight as we take a look at the Welshpool and Llanfire Light Railway in mid-1960s. At that time, most of the track is in situ. However, only the western end of the line between Llanfire and Castle Caerenion is in use. The line's original two locomotives, the Earl and the Countess, are both serviceable some 60 years after they first emerged from Manchester in 1902. The locomotives were just a year old when the railway was taken over by the Cambrian. This 9-mile-long line passed into Great Western ownership in 1922. Shortly afterwards, the locomotives made a visit to Swindon Works, where they acquired extra brass fittings, larger domes, and copper-capped chimneys. The line survived into BR ownership, and this is reflected in the black livery, which is worn by the Countess as she shunts at Llanfire Caerenion. The Earl sets out from this small town in the Banwy Valley for a journey of around 4 miles to Castle Caerenion. The first station at Heniath is a little over a mile from Llanfire. The Earl has a far from easy task ahead. There are several gradients, the steepest being 1 in 30. Both passenger and goods traffic was carried when the line opened, but in 1931 the passenger service ceased. A replacement bus service was introduced, but this only lasted until 1938. In addition to the curves and severe gradients, several level crossings slow the train's progress. The fireman gets out to open the gates at Caerphonnydd station. Minutes after leaving Llanfire Caerenion, the train arrives at the temporary terminus. It was not until the early 1980s that the railway began operating to a new station at Raven Square on the outskirts of Welshpool. Tight clearances and traffic congestion in this busy market town ruled out reinstating the final half-mile of track. The train approaches Caerphonnydd. Whilst the train stops at the station, the level crossing gates are opened. The Earl travels the remaining 2 miles and arrives at Llanfire Caerenion. Back in 1923, under Great Western ownership, the locomotive became number 822, and the nameplate was moved for position on the cab side. Countess became number 823 and was fitted with the nameplate Countess because the original name would not fit in the available space. With passenger services over for the day, the locomotive's next job is to run light engine to Kafroniv to collect the flat wagons in the siding. Although the passenger service ceased in 1931, goods trains lasted until 1956. Only 1 or 2 trains ran each day. The steep gradients limited the trains to 7 wagons. Not surprisingly, British Railway had little time for all this, and the line closed in 1956. Nowadays, the Festiniog Railway is the longest and one of the most successful narrow-gauge railways in Wales. We go back to the 50s when locomotives such as Prince and the Simplex tractor were used shortly after a small part of the line had been reopened following its abrupt closure in 1946. We also have pictures from the 60s with Fairlie's famous double tanks in action on the section from Porthmadog to Tannybulch. It was not until 1982 that trains ran through to Blaenau Festiniog. Two of the double tanks stand out of service at Boston Lodge. This is the site of the railway's locomotive works. It used to be a quarry, and the origin of the stone which was used in the construction of part of the line during the early 1800s. It's 1959, and Porthmadog station is very quiet as the handful of passengers wander around and wait for the locomotive to arrive from the shed. Built in 1863 by George England of London, Prince is one of the 4 original locomotives ordered for the line by Charles Spooner, the son of James, who was responsible for the survey and construction of the railway. Appropriately, Prince was involved with a shuttle service between Porthmadog and Boston Lodge in 1955. The locomotive maintained the service on its own until the end of the 1956 season. In 1959, when these sequences were filmed, Tannybulch is the destination for Prince. The train is seen crossing the Cobb. Several years later, Blanche leaves Boston Lodge and reverses along the Cobb to Porthmadog station. The locomotive was built in Leeds by Hunslet in 1893. Whilst the Earl of Merioneth is one of the later build of Fairlie double tanks. Blanche sets out from Porthmadog. Note the lack of line-side vegetation compared to the earlier sequences. The railway's double tanks go back to 1870, when little wonder was shown to a distinguished assembly of railway engineers. Robert Fairlie designed these double-bogied locomotives in response to the requirements to haul longer and heavier trains around the sharp curves and up the steep gradients. Although the railway no longer transports slate, these locomotives are still extremely useful in handling the heavier passenger trains during the summer months. Incidentally, the first true bogie coaches to enter service in Great Britain are still in use on the Festiniog Railway. As soon as the train leaves Porthmadog Harbour Station, it runs along the Cobb for almost a mile. This impressive structure was built as early as 1811, well before steam-hauled trains arrived on the scene. This is Linda, another product from Hunslet's works in Leeds. She was built at the same time as Blanche. Note the small volume of traffic on the A487. 3 miles from Porthmadog is the station at Penryn. The original station was located here at the level crossing, about 200 yards further on from the site of the present station. Tannibulch reopened in 1958. These sequences were taken the following year. The station is over 7 miles from Porthmadog by rail and 430 feet above sea level. Several years later, Blanche is viewed from the same vantage point. A few more years were to elapse before the service was extended to Thualt in 1968. The return journey is downhill for the most part. Note the simplex tractor at the rear of the train. Here's another view of the level crossing at Penryn. Prince approaches Minforth station, where there's a connection with the standard gauge system. One of the 262 tanks built at Swindon heads north. Prince was a regular sight at Minforth in 1956, the limit of passenger operations in those days. We pass Pen Cobb Halt and travel the remaining mile to the Festiniog's headquarters at Porthmadog. The locomotives in service on the Fairbourne Railway are the only ones in this programme which are not tank locomotives. In the 1960s, 4 locomotives are available for traffic on this 2-mile line, which runs from the line's headquarters at Fairbourne along the coast to connect with the ferry service from Barmouth. Half the fleet are 242s, which are of Great Western appearance. This is Katie. She entered traffic in 1954. Shan is similar in appearance, but was built 9 years later. The railway opened in 1895 as a 2-foot gauge horse-drawn tramway. In 1916, the railway was converted to 15-inch gauge. In 1985, some 20 years after these pictures were taken, the gauge changed to 12¼ inches. Except during inclement weather, a ferry connects with the trains. Also, a flag is flown here when trains are running. The largest locomotive on the line is Ernest W. Twining. Mumbles Pacific was built shortly after the Second World War. Count Louis is the oldest locomotive in service. Bassett Lauk turned out this 442 in 1924. Despite using tender locomotives, the railway does not possess a turntable, so all trains return to Fairborn tender first. Once back at Fairborn, a short ride behind a Great Western 262 tank takes us to Tywyn, where two Duke dogs have just arrived on a Talyllyn Railway special. Running in a northeasterly direction from Tywyn, the railway was built to take slate from Bryn Eglwys to the coast. Those familiar with the present-day Talyllyn will notice a different track layout in use at Tywyn when these pictures were taken in the 1960s. Talyllyn, Edward Thomas, a former Corris Railway locomotive, and Douglas are all seen at the railway's main station. For much of the 1960s, number 1, Talyllyn, proved to be a shy steamer and prone to mechanical breakdown. The locomotive is seen at Cynfile, one of several request halts on the line and almost 2 miles from Tywyn. Number 4, Edward Thomas, calls at Rydrionan, the oldest intermediate station. The track to the left of the locomotive was laid to allow slate from a nearby quarry to be loaded. It was removed in 1974. A mile further on is the passing loop and station at Bryn Glas. The loop replaced a siding in 1953 and was extended in 1961. Since these pictures were taken, a cabin has been built to house the lever frame and a siding added near the cars. Douglas sets out for Abergyn-Onwyn. Number 4 calls at Dolgork Station with a service to Tywyn. The only significant obstacle which faced the builders of the line in the 1860s was the deep, narrow gorge situated near the station. This 3-arch viaduct overcame the problem. The line continues to climb for a further 1 3/4 miles to Abergyn-Onwyn. Edward Thomas, a former Corris Railway locomotive, is seen arriving at the terminus. It became the first in Britain to be fitted with a Giesel ejector blast pipe and chimney in September 1958. This was installed personally by the inventor, Dr. Giesel Gieslingen. It was intended to improve the performance and reduce coal consumption, but this failed to live up to expectations on the Talyllyn. It was removed in 1969 and replaced by a conventional chimney, as these sequences show. Sequences filmed between 1959 and 1969 show the Vale of Rydal during a period of considerable change. After August the 11th, 1968, this 11 3/4 mile line between Aberystwyth and Devil's Bridge became British Rail's only steam-worked railway. Western Region chocolate and cream signs contrasted sharply with recently repainted diesel multiple units in the new corporate blue livery. Over at the shed, the locomotives are being prepared for service. 3 engines emerged from Swindon Works in 1923, shortly after the Great Western acquired the line from the Cambrian Railways. The original locomotives were built in 1902, when the line opened for passenger and freight traffic. Much of the latter traffic made use of the lines leading to the harbour at Aberystwyth until 1931, when goods trains ceased. The locomotive shed was some distance from the station. All light engine and empty stock movements had to pass over this level crossing near the narrow gauge platforms. Originally, the narrow gauge trains had their own station, which was built next to the Great Western structure already in existence. When services to Carmarthen ceased, the Vale of Rydal trains occupied the redundant platforms. A similar exercise took place when the standard gauge shed closed in 1965. Not only were there alterations to the infrastructure, locomotives and rolling stock liveries also changed during the 50s and 60s. Great Western chocolate and cream coaches were repainted into Cambrian bronze green in 1964 and then rail blue 4 years later. The Brunswick green locomotives acquired orange and black linings in 1957 and, like the coaches, were repainted blue in 1968. Somewhat surprisingly, the locomotives were overhauled at Oswestry Shed in the mid-1960s. This work was carried out on number 8 and number 9 at Chester during the winter season in the early 70s. The passenger service has never been intensive. There's only one passing loop. It is situated at Aberfrwd, which is nearer to Devil's Bridge than Aberystwyth. In 1963, the signal box was closed and the signal arms were removed. The unused track was removed sometime later, as this sequence taken in the late 60s shows. Incidentally, in 1989, when British Rail sold the line, one of the first things the new owners did was to reinstate the passing loop. The section from here to Devil's Bridge is the most demanding for the locomotives. The gradient is a constant 1 in 50 for 3.5 miles. Before the 1930s, lead and copper ore were brought here and then taken by train to the coast at Aberystwyth. In 1959, the sidings lie out of use. By the mid-60s, the semaphore signals remain, but sadly not for much longer, as number 9, Prince of Wales, and its 6-coach train travel the few remaining yards of the highly scenic railway from Aberystwyth to Devil's Bridge. Before the advent of diesel traction in 1986, the Snowdon Mountain Railway relied totally on its fleet of steam locomotives to transport thousands of tourists each year to the top of the highest mountain in Wales. The idea of a railway to the summit was conceived in the second half of the 19th century. But it was not until the Snowdon Mountain Tram Road and Hotels Company was formed in November 1894 that the dream became a reality. Starting at Llanberis, the railway runs for over 4.5 miles to the summit. These early morning sequences at Llanberis show 4 locomotives already coupled to their trains and a 5th engine in steam in front of the shed. The railway is very busy on fine days, with the first departure at 8:30. With the exception of Llanberis station and the locomotive yard and sidings, there's no level track on the railway. The train's a little over half a mile from the station and is already 500 feet above sea level. Llanberis Lake can be seen in the distance. The landscape has changed significantly by the time we reach the second passing place at halfway. The volume of traffic during the day means that maintenance work has to be done in the early morning and late evening. Once the engineer's train arrives at Llanberis, the locomotive will, no doubt, be used on passenger duties. The railway was built on the northwestern slopes of the mountain. It was laid to a gauge of 2 feet 7.5 inches and fitted with a double-bladed rack to a design of Dr. Act. The first passenger train ran on the 6th of April, 1896, but an accident occurred the same day and the railway closed for a year whilst the rack system was modified. The third and final passing place is at Clogwyn. There's still over a mile to travel to the summit. From Llanberis it takes an hour to reach terminus, which is 66 feet below the summit and 3,140 feet above Llanberis station. Each train consists of a locomotive and one coach with a seating capacity of 59. The locomotive is always placed at the Clanberis end of the formation and is not coupled to the coach. There's a footpath for the more athletic visitors to the area. It parallels the railway for much of the journey. We have to wait at Hebron station to allow an ascending train to pass. With gradients as steep as 1 in 5.5, the footplate crews prefer to keep on the move when going uphill. The vegetation becomes increasingly lush. The railway turns sharp right before making the final descent into Clanberis station, where the passengers will have an opportunity to take a close look at the locomotive. All the engines are 042 tanks and were built in Winterthur by the Swiss Locomotive Works. First 3 were in service when the line opened in 1895. A further 2 were delivered the following year. After the First World War, an order was placed for 3 more locomotives. The first 2 entered traffic in 1922, with the third following in 1923. Because all the track is inclined, the locomotives have to be fitted with angled boilers and chimneys. With Enid's work done for the day, it's time to take our leave of the Snowdon Mountain Railway. At first sight, trams running on standard gauge track along the South Wales coast may seem totally out of place in a programme such as this. However, we believe that these rare pictures taken in the final months of operation of a former steam-worked narrow gauge line are very worthy of inclusion. The Mumbles Railway ran from Rutland Street Station in Swansea to Mumbles Pier, a distance of almost 5.5 miles. The trams arrived in 1929, but by then the railway had been in existence for well over 100 years. It was built to transport coal and limestone in 1805, the gauge being either 4 feet or 4 feet 2 inches. It was relayed to standard gauge in 1855. The first steam locomotives arrived on the scene in 1877. The shed was located here at Rutland Street. Evidence suggests that regular passengers were first carried in 1807, almost certainly the first railway in the world to do so. However, in 1827, a turnpike road was built alongside the railway, with the result that the passenger traffic transferred to the road. By 1860, passenger traffic was back on the railway. A horse-drawn service started running between Swansea and Blackpill. The introduction of steam-hauled trains in 1877 was finally achieved after several tests had been carried out to assess the effect the locomotives had on horses using the road alongside the railway. In the early part of the 20th century, traffic on the line had become almost entirely passenger. At bank holiday periods, as many as 40,000 people were carried. Sometimes a single steam locomotive hauled 18 or 20 double-deck trams, conveying as many as 1,800 people. Between 1927 and 1929, the line was electrified at 650 volts DC. 11 new cars were built by Brush Electrical Engineering at Loughborough. As was the case with the steam rolling stock, the entrances are only on the landward side of the line. Each tram is capable of seating 106 passengers, 48 in the lower saloon and 58 on the top deck. They are the largest electrically driven tram cars in this country and weigh 30 tons. There's no evidence of signalling or any other safety devices on the railway until the advent of the trams, which are equipped with a dead man's handle. Spring-controlled points are used at passing places. The blades are locked and bolted and set for inwards running into the loop. Cars leaving the loop activate the mechanism to unlock the point and allow the tram to push the points against the return spring. In June 1954, a week of celebrations took place to mark the 150th anniversary of the Oystermouth Railway. After this, with the increasing use of the car, traffic declined and operating costs increased dramatically. Soon the company began to lose money, and despite almost 14,000 objections, plans were approved for a replacement bus service. The railway closed on the 5th of January 1960. The final train left Rutland Street at 11:42, conveying a party of invited guests. Today, part of the track bed of this historical railway is in use as a cycle path.